Hey, Leaf, good to be on this with you today. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Let me kind of put the "You Are Here" map up here. Whoops, that's the very last slide. Of course, we're not going to bore you with slideware, but we're going to show some data for you from some research that SEMGREP and Textron Research collaborated on recently. So we're going to be talking about secure guardrails in software development, and really give you some practical information, both what we saw in the research and also experiential from having implemented secure guardrails. So obviously, I think many of us would agree the security of the software that we're creating and delivering and operating is of a paramount importance, and increasingly, and we're always looking for ways of how do we make that easier to secure and balancing all the other factors that go into it. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. As I mentioned, we collaborated on this research. This is the event today is sponsored by SEMGREP, where Leaf joins us from. So it's good to be doing this with you. Leaf, would you introduce yourself and also tell us a little bit about SEMGREP?
Sure. So I'm Leaf. I've been in security for a little bit over a decade at this point. I got started doing security consulting. I was a sales engineer at BugCrowd during the early days of when bug bounties were getting popular. And then before SEMGREP, I spent a little bit over 5 years at a company called Segment, which later got acquired by Twilio. Originally as an internal AppSec engineer, then moved more into a software engineering role, helping build out a lot of customer-facing authentication and like security features. And then moved into engineering management and joined SEMGREP almost exactly a year ago, and manage a few teams that help build out the SEMGREP product. And the SEMGREP product, we're an application security platform with static analysis, software composition analysis, and secret scanning products. We can integrate into your editor or your CI systems and run rules written by our security research team or custom rules that you've written to help detect, prevent, and remediate issues in your code base. These rules can also be used to help you implement or enforce secure guardrails to help keep your customers' data safe.
Fantastic. Super. Again, thanks to SEMGREP for sponsoring our event today. Let's start out with kind of a working definition of what secure guardrails. That could mean a lot of things to a lot of different people. Maybe some folks not familiar with the term. One that we like to use is think of secure guardrails as mechanisms that help guide developers about how and create kind of secure by design software coding, and that has real-time feedback during and early in the development process, can be in the editor at commit time, CI/CD processes, part of code reviews, etc. So trying to supply and equip developers with information about that will help them create secure software. And this could be things that are, common, universal types of best practices, as well as specific ways that your organization or your team likes to implement security in software. So it could be about like how the database wrappers that you use instead of raw queries, or approved authentication mechanisms, whatever it is. I think the important thing to really emphasize is the emphasis on developer experience, right? Not every developer needs to or wants to be a security expert, but you want to do this in a way that also is minimal friction to their job, right? Fits into the flow of the work. As they're creating, debugging, or enhancing code, whatever they might be doing, and try to work within that flow rather than things that are going to slow them down or get in the way. So hopefully that definition makes sense to folks. We're looking for ways to how do we implement these things, these secure guardrails systematically. I do want to say too, before we get too far in, we love to have people chat with us during this conversation. We're going to be showing slides, but they're just charts. They're just data. They're not where you're not getting pitched on a presentation. We really just want to use this data to help facilitate the conversation. So love to have your comments and reactions. What do you think based on what you're hearing? What's your reaction to the data? Maybe you have a different perspective. Pop that into the chat with us, and we of course love to have your questions. You're welcome to put those into the Q&A. We'll try to get those while we're talking. And by the way, thanks to the folks who already submitted a couple questions. So put those in anytime and we'll fit them into the flow. And if we don't get to them right away, we'll fit them into later into the conversation. We're going to go about an hour today. Also, today's webinar is being recorded. So sit back, relax. You might hear something interesting you want to go back and watch later, show with a colleague, someone that you're working with, or I'll go back and kind of say, what was that Leaf said? I want to look at that further. So that'll be recorded, and you'll have access to that as well as our handouts. So we're going to be talking about the research that we did. But before we did that, I'd love for you, Leaf, if you can kind of help us make secure guardrails real. Give us some real world examples of what we're talking about.
Sure. Yeah, so I have a couple of examples. The first one is from my previous job at Segment. We had gotten a few bug bounty submissions related to cross-site scripting. Thankfully, we were a React shop, and so for the most part, we were in pretty good shape just because the language makes it relatively hard to introduce cross-site scripting. But there were a few instances where we actually needed to take user input to generate links. And so those, we found ourselves with some cross-site scripting because of JavaScript hrefs. And so we made changes to our link component that provided safe default behavior for hyperlinks. And so we restricted the scheme to things like HTTP, HTTPS, mail to, tell, to prevent JavaScript. And then if we detected that it was an external link, we also included things like the no refer. And this was just something that people were already used to using. They didn't really need to think about it. They were already going to use this link component. And so why not make it safe by default? And then another one from semgrep is we have a custom semgrep rule that when it finds a Flask route, it makes sure that there's an authorization check present in that route. It also gives you an override. Not every route needs a check. Some things like loading the login page itself are public, but you need to annotate the route to show that this was intentional and not a mistake. And so here's a couple of examples of things that make it easy for developers to do the right thing while providing them the context and just making it so that they are making good decisions without introducing a vulnerability. But we'd love to hear if your org has some awesome guardrails. We'd love to have you type it out in the chat.
Yeah, I was just typing out what you said. Make it easier for the developer to do the right thing. What a great way to think about it. That kind of sums it up right there, right? Make it easy for us. I'm curious, before we kind of jump into the data, Leaf, are secure guardrails most common things that we all kind of know about? We just sometimes forget or just because of the pressures of the job and busyness, sort of overlook at times, or there's some things that get into more esoteric. Maybe I don't know those things. I'm a good developer, but I'm not necessarily an expert at how to create secure code under all circumstances.
Yeah, I mean, I really think that whenever possible, we should be making it easy for developers to make good security choices. And oftentimes that means just abstracting the choice away from them so that they don't even have to remember or really know about what's happening. I mean, I'm sure there's developers at Segment that don't know about cross-site scripting being possible via links, and it's probably irrelevant for them for their job for the most part because they're just using this underlying link component that's safe. And I think that's great. I mean, developers these days have so many things to keep track of, especially if you're a developer that spans portions of the stack. You have to know front-end code, you have to know back-end code, you have to know about database stuff, you have to know about monitoring and logging and detecting problems with performance, and security is just one of 100 things that we're expecting developers to know. And I think it is fair for developers to fully own the services that their team works on, and that includes security, in my opinion. But the more things that the infrastructure team can make easy for developers, the more things that the security team can make easy for developers, really, I think it's it's better because developers don't have time to be experts on all of this stuff. And the fewer things that they actually have to understand, I think is better. And sure, you're always going to need to know how to operate outside of the guardrails or operate in like some sort of infrastructure situation that isn't common enough for your company to provide a paved road for. But I think day to day, we can prevent a lot of mistakes by making the things that people are likely to encounter easy to do a good job on.
It's a really good point. Whether it's the security landscape that's changing things and constantly changing and evolving the threats, but also, the environment we might work in. Maybe you're new to this environment. You just got put on this project, or company got acquired. Now you're suddenly working on something you're not as familiar with, or a technology or a stack or language. So lots of reasons why having something that makes it easy for you to implement, the developers for implement secure code.
And on that note, in the handouts, there's a link to a list of open source guardrails that was put together from my coworker, Clint Gibler. You might know him from the TLDR-Sec newsletter, but it's a really nice list. It's categorized by both vulnerability type, which it prevents, as well as language. So you can go and find like Ruby cross-site scripting protection. The link component that I mentioned earlier from my days at Segment is actually in that list, but it's definitely worth checking out to see if you can avoid reinventing the wheel and see if there's something that is already going to provide value to your company without you having to write it yourself.
Great. And that's just up in the, I think at least on my interface, is the upper right corner. It says handouts right up there by the chat. Should be in a similar location for you. So there's a bunch of good stuff to download, including our Pulsemeter report, which we're going to dive into some of the information from that now. So let me bring that up. What we did is TechStrong is the organization that runs websites like DevOps.com, Security Boulevard, Cloud Native Now, TechStrong AI, a number of different topics around software development, and cloud. And we put together a list of poll questions and asked our audience, people who were visiting the sites, their thoughts on secure guardrails. And so we took this data, did some analysis on it, put it into a document, and that's what's in the handout section. We call it a Pulsemeter. But these are some of the components, the data components out of that analysis that we're going to walk through and kind of have some reaction to. Again, if you have comments about the data you're seeing, like, I don't believe that, I have a totally different experience, or, yep, I've lived that. That's my world. Feel free to jump in with your comments and reactions to it as well. So first question was just kind of getting an idea of, so do you implement secure guardrails in whatever form that might mean in your software development or your SDLC process? Interestingly, yes, extensively across projects. So about a third, almost a third of folks said, yeah, this is a thing we take seriously and we do it across, all of our efforts. On the other end, kind of conversely, about the same, 30% said no and no plans to implement. Maybe they weren't familiar with secure guardrails, or maybe saw some challenges to be able to do it and just not tackling that. And then other folks were kind of in the middle of that spectrum, like, yeah, but we don't do it for everything, or no, but we're planning to, or we're in the middle of this process. So it's kind of interesting that it fell into those three groups. Leif, what's your reaction to this? Any of those numbers jump out at you as, I didn't expect that, or maybe you did?
To be honest, I would have expected them to almost be the exact opposite. I would have expected the three in the middle to kind of dominate the percentages. I think that, at least from the folks that I've talked to, most are somewhere in between the, like, hey, we think this is a good idea, but we haven't gotten around to it, to the, like, maybe we've done something, or maybe we've done it just for specific products. If you had asked me beforehand, I would have expected the people that haven't, or that have done it extensively across products, to be very low. I'd expect the next three to maybe be like, I don't know, 25% each, or so, like somewhere around there. And then I would have also expected the no with no plans to implement to be on the lower side, maybe like 15%. I think is probably where I would have put that one, somewhere in that range. So yeah, this one was definitely surprising to me.
It could be sometimes, this is a reflection of the audience that we're asking, right? If we got a group of developers together, might get one set of responses. If we're asking a broader population of people who are visiting DevOps.com from all different career paths, maybe get a little different response. So I'm not sure if that's why or not, but it's interesting. That's your reaction as well. I also thought the 31% was pretty high. And that could mean people have lots of definition of what secure guardrails are. So, maybe that's just code scanning for vulnerabilities. Maybe it's something else. It's hard to say. Whoops, looks like I may have lost Leap there. So we'll get him back connected here in just a moment. And again, feel free to jump in. Paul says that's one fascinating slide. I'm not sure why it's fascinating to you, Paul. Let us know. I'm curious what your response to that is. I know when I started working with the SEMGREP team on this project and thinking about secure guardrails, it definitely makes a difference if you're thinking about policy as code, kind of like maybe even a security person would think about it, or you think about it as a development process and in the flow of creating software, the workflows, the DevOps pipelines, whatever methods that you're using. You think about more and more detailed where those places are and how that information feeds back to the developer to say, either this is taken care of, you don't even know about it, or it's something, here's a better way or a way to do that. How often do secure guardrails tell you here's a better way to do it, Leaf, or just tells you that there's something that needs to be addressed here? Because I know developers don't like to be bothered by things they don't know what to do with, right?
Yeah, I think really the ideal secure guardrail in my mind is one that the developer doesn't even really know exists or need to know exists. It's something where the security team or maybe an internal developer experience team has built some piece of common functionality that just inherently is making good security choices at the same time. It might be like providing an authentication library or an encryption library, or maybe if you use this standard logging client, it's going to redact things that shouldn't be getting sent to the rest of the logging pipeline or something like that. And so I think that that's the ideal case. I think that there's also a use case for something that reminds people to use the right thing. So if you can detect, hey, you're using this older library that isn't what we recommend anymore, you should be using this new one, and giving a link or a way for somebody to easily make the right decision, or offering an auto fix replacement or something like that if the libraries are if they can just be used interchangeably. And then I think it's still a guardrail in my mind, but I think the next layer down is detecting something, pointing out that it's an issue, and maybe you could still provide some guidance, but it's not something that you can just fix for the developer or just tell them to hey, use this other thing instead. They still have to figure out how to do something, how to do that thing in a secure way. So I think all of those are guardrails in my mind, but really the pinnacle of guardrails is just providing something that developers use, and it's well written, and they don't even really need to think about the security aspects of it.
That actually ties really well to a question that Lynn asked in our Q&A about how can secure guardrails be integrated in the SDLC without hindering productivity. It sounds like is as often as you can to kind of take care of it for the developer without disrupting their cognitive load and their workflow, the better, or guide them to a way of doing something differently that isn't going to cause them to, totally disrupt their flow, would make a big difference.
Yeah. Make it as easy as possible.
Okay. All right. Let's move on to our next one. What are some of the biggest challenges? Oh, by the way, there was one other thing I wanted to say on this before I moved off of it. One reaction I also had to this slide was, if I'm in the 30%, I would ask myself, what am I missing? What's going on with this secure guardrails, and what should I be thinking about that I'm not yet? Or is there something I'm missing? With what's happening with this? If we have that many, really, essentially almost a little over half of the folks responding are doing this as part of their development. So, one of those things, you're always on the lookout to kind of baseline what you do versus other colleagues and peers. So
I'm going to drop a quick link in the chat. I think this is a really interesting blog. It has a few safe Golang libraries, and what I like about some of these is they actually design them to be drop-in replacements of the core language library. And so you should just be able to like replace your existing usage. All of the APIs that exist in the core language library exist in this version as well. And so in theory, you should just be able to do a search and replace for the original library, instead swap over to this one, and it should just handle a bunch of things for you. And so I think that guardrails of that nature that are very easy to migrate to are great. And then you could write a rule using your static analysis tool, like SemGrub, for example, to detect the usage of the old library, and then just recommend like, hey, this is what you should be doing instead.
Mm-hmm. Great. Jared, if you're not doing something else, if you wouldn't mind adding that link to our handouts, that would be great. The bug hunters link would be fantastic. Great. Check out that link, please. So what are the biggest challenges facing in implementing secure guardrails within your development process? Awareness and understanding, getting support, right? And making sure everybody's sort of on the same page about why this is important. Maybe that's a leading cause of being in that bottom third of not doing it. Sometimes we also end up so much in the business of our tool set and integrating things on all the efforts to the environment that we're trying to use to build code, so build applications. That becomes too big of a challenge. And do you want to take on those difficulties, those elements? I mean, cost, do we have the tools to do this? Resistance from development teams. I can imagine, hi, I'm Mitch, I'm from security and I'm here to help. And they're like, oh yeah, great. What do you have for us today? It's making sure that you're helping people understand what we're looking to do and how this would fit within their workflow can make a big difference as well. What are your reactions to this, Leaf?
Yeah, I'm a little bit surprised to see the lack of awareness so high. The next four, I would say, are not surprising to me. And I think in many ways, they're all kind of related. I think that if you had better tools, the technical difficulties would probably be lower. If you had more people on your security team, which I'm just going to assume is a cost constraint, you could probably build better tools. If the tools were better, you'd probably have less resistance from developers, because if the stuff's easy to use, I actually think the average developer does care about security, and I think is willing to use things that aren't going to slow them down and are well-written tools themselves. And I think that over the last 5 years, definitely the last 10 years, we've seen much more empathetic security teams develop and much more engineering focused security teams become the norm. And so I really do think that having people that have like a combined engineering and security mindset, building tools for other teams, is the way that you make these things usable. So yeah, I really think that items 2, 3, 4, 5 are all intertwined.
Mm-hmm. Also helps if those folks have done that or similar kinds of jobs too. I've been a developer. I've experienced these kind of issues and challenges. Now I'm helping other developers solve those problems. The only thing I was wondering about the lack of awareness, do you work, I'm guessing, with a lot of different sized organizations. Do you see any differences in the kind of makeup of the, a 50,000 person company with 3,000 developers is going to think about it differently than a 5-person shop who are doing a startup or something? Is there a difference in that causes that lack of understanding or awareness, or do you not really see any correlation?
I think it naturally gets harder the bigger the org is, but I don't know that org size is necessarily the way that this stuff gets broken down. We work with companies of all sizes, and there's big companies that seem to have things together pretty well. There's other big companies that really have quite immature security programs. And then on the flip side, there's some smaller companies where, because even though the business is small, because they're selling to enterprises early, like they just have to care about this stuff a lot earlier in their lifespan than they might have had to 5 or 10 years ago. I really think that if you're selling to other businesses, the scrutiny on you to do a good job on security has really been ratcheted up, because companies don't want to buy from a company that's going to cause them to have to respond to their customers. Ultimately the vendors you choose are your fault. It doesn't really matter if it was you that got breached or one of your vendors that got breached. Like, your customers are still impacted. So yeah, I do think that it's hard to attribute this to org size. I do think the bigger an org gets, it gets harder, because once you start buying companies and giving developers more freedom to use different tools and different languages and things like that, it just gets harder and harder to provide these kind of like foundational controls and improvements. One of the things that I think really helped us at Segment was we had a very homogeneous tech stack. Almost everything was either in Go or TypeScript. And so if you did provide something to developers as a security team or as a developer tooling or a foundations team, you only had to make sure that it worked with those two languages, and anything else was unlikely to be something that a developer team was using. Contrast that with a company that just doesn't care and like lets teams pick whatever they want. Then it gets a lot harder, because you have some teams using Python, some teams using Ruby, some teams using JavaScript, whatever. Like, every one of those is going to potentially need its own version of that guardrail to be successful.
I'm going to hold off, but we've got the AI question already. So we'll get your thoughts on that here in a little bit when we get a little deeper into this. Let's jump to the next one. What kind of capabilities do you prioritize in thinking about it, Guardrail, how you would implement it? Ease of integration into your workflows. We've talked a fair amount about that. Comprehensive coverage of security vulnerabilities. It doesn't make sense to do it if you're not going to catch, the important things. Being able to adapt it to your project needs. That's one I'd love to hear your thoughts on. What are some of the areas that you need that kind of flexibility or adaptability? And of course, impact on developer speed. Before we get your reaction to this, David in the chat said, the developers care, but they get a strong message that upstream business does not care. I'm sure that's not unique to David. We've all kind of heard, I need that stuff now. Yeah, take care of your security. I pay you to do that, but get me my code, get me my capability released in the market here, because I'm measured on that, right? I'm sure you run into that a fair amount.
Yeah, I mean, I think it really depends on the organization, but I do think this is changing mostly because of regulation and like companies being scared of like fines and things like that, which would have been great for them to care because it's the right thing to do. But I do think that this is something that companies are having to take more and more seriously. I also think that it's something that is, like I mentioned earlier, more and more important to win B2B business. But hopefully things like regulation can protect B2C businesses, because the average individual consumer can't really sway a company to make better security decisions the way that a business can when they're operating with another business.
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting point. Regulation doesn't sound like it's necessarily our friend, but it can be, because it forces us to do some things in the organization that without it, we may not take as seriously or go as far with. So there are some benefits to that as well. And even though it might be painful at times to deal with. Any other reaction on these? I'd love to hear about where do you need flexibility and adaptability about how you implement secure guardrails.
Yeah, so I think of ease of integration and minimal impact on development speed. I think of those as being pretty similar, and those combined would occupy about 50%. I think that a good guardrail is something that developers aren't annoyed with. If it does ping them on something, it also makes it easy for them to remediate it, or it just takes care of it. So I do think that a well-written guardrail is going to be something that's well tested and like within the context of your organization, so it's not going to cause problems. And then in terms of customizability for specific project needs, I think that kind of gets into dubious value territory, because if it's something that only one project is going to need, I think that's a good opportunity for the developers that own that project and security to partner on something to do something that works for that project, but you're not going to invest the same amount of time in something that can be used throughout the organization if it's only used on one project, even if that project is very important within your org. I think that the investment needs to be based off of how important the data is and how important that service is to your customers.
Okay, great. Let's take a look at our next data point, and we're going to get to some more questions here that have come to us. I appreciate it. There's been a lot of reaction in both in chat and Q&A, so thanks for being with us and being part of the conversation today. How effective do you find secure guardrails in preventing security vulnerabilities in your projects? So 24% said highly effective, 31%, somewhat effective, a third, not that many at the bottom end, 5 and 7%. So most people are saying, yeah, this is good, it's helpful, right? I mean, a third is somewhat effective, says that, things are getting by, or maybe it's a little bit difficult to implement that kind of thing. As you've done it in your own career, implemented secure guardrails yourself, or as you work with organizations as part of some SEMGRAP, what do you see as that threshold? How long do you start to see an impact being made, and how long until does it usually take to get where you really feel like you're going to be in maybe one of those highly effective or effective categories?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's really going to be related to, one, how much investment you put in, and two, how complicated and nuanced the problem is that you're trying to solve. For example, the safe link thing that I've talked about a few times did not take that long to implement, maybe a couple of days. And I don't know that we got any JavaScript based href based cross-site scripting vulnerabilities after that. So from that standpoint, I would say that it was highly effective. We had another guardrail at Segment that would analyze during the testing process. It would analyze which tables you were accessing in your database and try to see if you were making the correct corresponding authorization check. And the process wasn't perfect. It was sometimes hard to tell, like, whether you made an authorization check, but it wasn't quite the right one. It was close. But then there were other instances where if you were doing something that was like completely off, it could pretty easily catch, like, hey, you're not making the right check for this table. And so something like that, I would probably put it in the like effective bucket, not the highly effective bucket. That one also took longer to develop, but the problem was just much more nuanced and much more difficult to build something that was robust for. And it still caught a good amount of these cases. And all of these were things that could have caused problems for customers or resulted in a bug bounty report. And so honestly, I think even if something is somewhat effective, as long as it wasn't too expensive to build, even if it catches like 60% of the issues, that's still pretty good in my book, depending on the investment. So, and like the guardrails that you find that are paying off, you can always invest more into them if it's something that you think can be improved by like additional investment in whatever that thing is.
So really good point. It doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. It doesn't have to be all or nothing. It's perfect and it catches everything every time, or don't use it, right? I mean, sure, we would love them all to be 100% in every case, but getting close to handling most times that issue comes up or might be observed is a huge, step in the right direction. And as you mentioned, I can imagine creating guardrails that achieve a purpose, but under all cases and all conditions, that can be pretty challenging because there's a lot of edge cases in software and how it works and the environment that we're working in and data that it might be processing at that point. There's a lot of variables you've got to work.
Yeah. And I mean, similar to building a product, I mean, this is something that I struggle with all the time as an engineering manager is, okay, we have a bunch of stuff that customers want from us. Do we build something to 80% of what they want? Do we build it to 90%? Do we build it to 95%? Mm-hmm. And oftentimes it gets more and more expensive from an engineering standpoint to go from 80 to 90, 90 to 95. And so the same thing applies to your security org's resources. You don't have unlimited resources. There's tons of problems you could go out and solve to make your organization safer. Is it better to have 3 somewhat effective guardrails that each catch 60% of the issues? Or is it better to have one of those things that is highly effective? And I mean, it's obviously going to depend on your situation and, your business and whatever, but I'd argue that in most cases, it's probably better to have something that's catching like 75% of the issues for 10 different categories than feeling like you have 2 things that are close to 100% effectiveness.
Okay, great. Interesting. Let's see, one of our last slides here. What are your organization's plans regarding adoption of or enhancement of secure guardrails over the next year? So 25% saying they're going to expand the use of it, 22% going to enhance existing guardrails that they've implemented, 70% kind of steady state, stay where we are, 11% saying we're going to kind of reduce how much we rely on this. And then, of course, kind of fitting back into that original 30%, 26 saying no plans because they're probably not doing anything with secure guardrails. I would imagine my reaction to this is the 22 and the 25%, 50% of the respondents to this seems like an ongoing challenge, right? I'm not saying it's as much work as it is to get started as to keep it going, but it isn't also a set and forget. You might be able to do that for the developers in some of those guardrails, but you're going to want to kind of incrementally improve your software, kind of what you were talking about, 80-20, right? How far do you go? And also as the landscape changes, as your software and your environment changes or security changes. Any thoughts on how you kind of keep aware of what's happening and knowing what to tackle next? How do you make those decisions?
Yeah, that's definitely a tough one. I think one of my all-time favorite tweets about security is from Dino, who's the head of security at Cash App, which is part of Square. And I don't remember exactly the phrasing, but it's something along the lines of, if your engineering team doesn't like your security team, you're never going to be effective. And I really think that having a good relationship with your engineering team makes it a lot easier to figure out what you should be working on next. Because if the developers like you, they're going to proactively come to you and tell you about things that are worrying them. They're going to be more forthcoming if you do design reviews and that kind of things. And I think like any cross-functional team at a company, within engineering or otherwise, just having a pulse on what is important to your company and like what the big projects are is going to help you figure out where you should be investing in guardrails going forward. I think you can also look backwards at bug bounty data, pen testing data, internal findings, that kind of thing, and use that as a way to shape what you build guardrails for. A lot of these problems are not going anywhere unless you do something about them. And so if you have a huge problem with authorization checks or cross-site scripting or whatever, it's probably going to continue to be a problem in the absence of you doing something. And so I think like looking backwards at the data and then looking forward at like where your org is investing as a whole is a good way to figure out where you should be putting points.
Yeah, the enemy is not the other part of the organization. It's doing a great job of delivering what we're working on, right? It takes us all to help get us there. Let's just jump to some questions. And by the way, all of this, and I'll just show this again, all this data and some write-up is included in this Pulse Meter document. It's in the handout section. You can go there and download it for free. We'll also include it in the email that will follow up the webinar with the recording and such. There's also some other great resources in the handout section. The podcast that got mentioned earlier, that Leaf's a part of. A scripting document. We've got some SemGrep information, etc. So check that out. There's a lot of good resources, and download those things now while you've got the chance. Some good stuff to get a hold of. So let's talk a little bit about there's a number of questions we can go into, but one that really caught my eye here was, let me pull that back up here. There we go. What about guardrails that deal with reusing code or open source? You could add AI generated or augmented code, are there special guardrails that you need to deal with those kind of circumstances, or they generally fall into the same kind of guardrails you're going to do with code you've written? What's your experience like?
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure what the question is asking, but if it's related to known vulnerabilities in open source code, I think that there's a lot of software composition analysis vendors out there. SemGrep has a software composition analysis product that can identify vulnerabilities in code. When I was an AppSec engineer at Segment, we would actually fail CI builds if there was a higher critical vulnerability that had an upgrade available. And so our reasoning behind that was we didn't want to fail developers' builds if there was no way for them to resolve the vulnerability. And maybe the answer in some of these cases is like, hey, this thing is actually so outdated that you should be exploring the use of a new library. But that's really work that needs to be planned and budgeted for. It's not just something quick that the developer can go in and update the package. And sometimes even updating the package is not a quick fix. I've been there as well, where to get to a non-vulnerable version, enough of the functionality has changed that you actually do need to go in and do a lot more testing and maybe even change your code that relies on this third-party package. And so we did have ways for the developers to get exceptions and things like that. But generally speaking, this worked pretty well and allowed us to have some confidence that the developers were incrementally upgrading packages. And then what was the second part about AI?
Oh, yeah, AI generated code or augmented code. Any thoughts on that? That's relatively new, but we've all been using code completion in our IDEs, and now with Copilot and others supplementing code to that. It's a bit of a wild west of what that all means. So I'm sure there's not all the answers figured out. But do you have any thoughts about AI generated code, or do you treat that kind of today similar to as if a human generated it?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two aspects. One, I think we really need companies that are providing AI generated code to be trying to make that code as secure as possible, because realistically, if they don't do it, a lot of people are just going to use it and it's going to be in bad shape. But from what you can do as your company, I really don't think it should be treated any different than code that your developer writes. At the end of the day, it's still going to go through the same CI process. It's still going to get deployed. It's still going to be stuff that your customers interacted with. And once the code is up and running in the systems, the system doesn't care who wrote the code. It doesn't care if it's you or me or an AI. And so I really think that from that standpoint, a lot of the existing things that you would be doing to detect issues in code, whether it's static analysis or other tests that you might have, it should apply to your AI or human generated code the same.
Mm-hmm. One way you could argue it is there's also bias too, if you assume that AI generated code has these characteristics. Well, it may not, because in theory, those things what it's generating came from a human originally, right? So at some point, at least with current generation of Gen AI, that a lot of that source material is coming from us, right? Mm-hmm. Being processed and reprocessed, delivered through Gen AI. How about, let's see, are there other places where this would fit into the workflow, like in a DevOps workflow? We talked about the IDE, we talked about CI/CD. Is it part of like a GitHub action? Where are the places that you might integrate something like SemGrep into the process flow?
Yeah, so you can integrate SemGrep in a lot of different places. Really, I think the earlier that you can catch things, the better. So we do have an IDE extension. You can run SemGrep in pre-commit. Even if you do those things, you're still going to need to run it in CI just as a backup. I kind of think of running stuff in the developer's like computer as like a client side check, where you're just kind of trusting them to do the right thing, and like hopefully it catches some stuff. But really, developers are always going to be able to bypass those checks, which is fine. Like sometimes those checks break, and you just want to be able to commit your code so that it doesn't get lost. And so you do also need checks in CI to make sure that things aren't sneaking through. And then SemGrep also can run just in a way where you can see the results in our platform. And so you don't necessarily have to block or comment on everything that you want to detect. Some of the things that you might still be working on, like tuning the rule or just kind of seeing how it performs with your developers, you might want it to be invisible to the developers so they don't even know that the rule's running. And then you can just gather data over time. And if the rule is something that you trust and you think is something that developers should deal with it autonomously, you can promote it from like a monitor to a block.
Great. I'm curious to, one of the questions was asked, we haven't talked about SBOMs, very popular topic in the software supply chain world. Where does this fit into the context? Because you mentioned software composition analysis, which is obviously one of the things that feeds into creating SBOM. Does this play a role, this part play a role into the creation of SBOMs, or is this an upstream process before you get to that step?
Yeah, I mean, I don't really think of SBOM as being part of like the guardrails portion of security. I think the industry is still kind of figuring out what we're going to do with SBOMs. I know there was the famous White House order about SBOMs, and I think we're going to see kind of a trickle down effect similar to what we've seen with SOC 2, where the government or more conservative organizations start asking for SBOMs. The companies that sell to those organizations then probably start asking their vendors for SBOMs. Much in the way that, once you get SOC 2, you need to start asking your vendors about SOC 2, and it kind of just percolates throughout the ecosystem. I think that one of the things that is going to be challenging right now is, okay, so you get an SBOM, what do you do with it? Like, it's not realistic to expect every vendor to patch every single piece of open source technology that they're using. Plenty of those don't have vulnerabilities in them that actually meaningfully impact the software. One of the things that's cool about SemGrep is we have reachability analysis for our software composition analysis product. So we actually write SemGrep rules to determine if your usage of the package is vulnerable. And so I think that we're going to see some vendors out there like Manifest Cyber, which is going to help you process like incoming SBOMs, help companies make sense of this. But I think SBOMs are really still in their infancy, and we're going to need to just see how stuff plays out and see what companies actually end up doing with them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. It's early, SBOMs are, I think, an important concept. I kind of think of it as like taking a photo at a point in time, right? If you have a photo of someone who delivered of the package sitting on your doorstep, right? Doesn't mean it's not that it's still there when you go back, right? Or conditions haven't changed, or something's rained, or somebody replaced the contents with something else. A point in time is helpful, but software is a fluid process, right? So it really has to be built, and also it has to be automated in some way, because people can't look at that SBOM and every time and go track down every individual component that's in that. So a lot of maturing to do that, but it's definitely a step in the right direction. We're getting close to our time together with everybody. I'm curious, what are your thoughts around AI and how that fits into this picture? We talk about AI, using AI to generate code, but also writing test cases to test our software, maybe security test cases. Might it be helpful to write secure guardrails, or those a little too specific for what we're doing today? What are your thoughts about where AI can help us either now or down the road?
Yeah, I mean, I love using AI for boring stuff. I think it's great for doing tasks that I already know how to do, I just don't want to do. So like, I'll often give it a section of code and be like, hey, write me tests for this. And sometimes it comes up with test cases I would have come up with. Sometimes it comes up with ones that I wouldn't have. Sometimes it makes mistakes that I have to go in and fix. But overall, I think it saves a lot of time on things like that. I think an area that it could be pretty interesting on Guardrails is I think it could make it a lot easier for companies that have very diverse environments in terms of their tech stacks to be able to more easily write guardrails that apply across language. So I think we could get to a point where AI could be trusted to do a translation from like Java to Python or Ruby. And so if you wrote a guardrail for your company for, a couple of the core languages, and then people want to use it in some other more like fringe instances, I think that like AI could maybe help you with that translation work so that other parts of your business can benefit from the guardrails. Yeah, I mean, I would say overall, like I'm very optimistic that AI will make delivering software like faster and safer. I think that there's also risks associated with it, just the way that there's, we make the same mistakes every time there's a new type of software to be written. Like we made a bunch of the same mistakes in IoT that we made in web. We saw auto manufacturers make a bunch of the same mistakes that we have made before. There's new mistakes, old mistakes with AI, but I really think in the next few years, it will have like a meaningful positive impact on software development.
Mm-hmm. I agree with that. I think it's one of those, it's kind of like having a teenage driver, right? You're not going to let them handle every use case of driving an automobile. You're going to let them develop that over time, and you build trust in it and kind of see that they're great at handling those tasks, and great. Then you have more confidence in letting someone do more things, or AI doing more things for you too. One last question I wanted to ask here. Let me go back and find it here. We had some questions around different industries. Now, regulatory requirements, privacy regulations, of course, can differ across industries. Do you find that there are often secure guardrails you want to implement because you're in pharmaceutical or healthcare or finance or government kinds of environments?
Sorry, I was responding to some folks in the chat.
Okay. Do you find different guardrails necessary depending on what industry you're in, or not very often?
I think that there's some guardrails that are kind of core across like companies using the same languages. Like going back to that link that I shared from Clint, I think that any company that's writing a web app in Ruby can probably make use of similar cross-site scripting protections. But I do think that there are always going to be guardrails that are bespoke to the business that your company is in. And maybe even companies within the same industry are going to have different guardrails. But I do think that there's always something unique about your business. And like that's where custom guardrails are going to come into play, as something that you write to solve this problem for you. So I think it's both.
Okay, good. I put a link. I was actually in the handout section if you want to try out SemGrep and get some hands on yourself and try this. Well, we're just about at the end of our time. Any parting thoughts before we wrap things up, Leaf, and let everybody get back to their IDEs or whatever environment they were working in? Maybe it's another Zoom meeting. Who knows?
Yeah, no, I appreciate folks taking the time to join in.